Vesalius' work was, in fact, a stroke of genius, but it grew out of a historical context in which his teachers, his contemporaries, began to emphasize the importance of direct observation. And this became a very important emphasis for Vesalius, but he didn't make that up. He got that out of the most advanced anatomists of his time and realized that there was a way to affect that sense of observation and the reliance upon observation. Vesalius never mentions people of his own time as influencing his anatomy. He formed a persona, a personality, out of Galen. And so, like Michelangelo, who claimed to be self-taught, Vesalius claimed that he had no masters, no one who really taught him directly. The Fabrica was written for a multiple audience. It was written for students of anatomy as a manual of dissection, but it was all written as a monograph about anatomy for other anatomists. Just as philosophers write mostly for other philosophers, anatomists had the same tendency to write for other anatomists. No, students who had the means would have bought the Epitome, which was published in the same year in a very large format. They used it as a handbook for their anatomical studies and for their clinical work. And as a result, the Epitome is much more rare than the Fabrica, which was a coffee table book. The Epitome was a handbook. What was new in the Fabrica was a belief that students and anatomists alike should regard their own personal visual experience as the ultimate authority in anatomy, rather than books, either Arabic books translated into Latin or the works of Galen translated or not translated. They believed that you don't do anatomy out of a book. The spirit of the Fabrica could be described in a number of ways. In the first place, as polemical, quarrelsome, rather sharp in its expressions, stern in its admonition to anatomists not to spoil a specimen by cutting too far or not cutting enough. So it has a rather harsh temper. Vesalius' contemporaries received the Fabrica with a mixture of admiration for the illustrations, admiration for its completeness, and a suspicion of its setting aside of Galen as the ultimate authority. Vesalius was raised to be a humanist, with reverence for the authority of the ancient authors who presumably could do no wrong. But Vesalius realized many times that they did wrong because they were using Galen's animal anatomy rather than the anatomy of the human body. The source of dead bodies, mostly for Galen and his contemporaries, was cadavers of criminals or accused criminals who had been executed. And for that reason, neck anatomy suffered because the noose spoiled much of the anatomy of the larynx and the hyoid bone. So when Vesalius illustrates the hyoid bone, the bone he illustrates is not that of a human subject. Vesalius' method of dissection was governed largely by the rapidity with which a body would decay. And so traditional anatomy started with the soft tissues and then went on to the hard tissues, which didn't decay. But when he wrote the Fabrica, he started with the bones and then went to the muscles. So the Fabrica actually reverses the traditional order of dissection. In the Renaissance, the dissection of human cadavers was an accepted practice. In the first place, because dissection was often relied upon as a means of determining the cause of death. And so we have these legal expectations that a post-mortem examination would explain how a person died, and if he died by fair means or by natural means. So dissection was fully integrated into the legal and educational and scientific agendas of his time. The Catholic Church had mixed feelings about any scientific thought because they believed in revelation, they believed in the absolute truth of the Bible. For example, the idea that Adam had one fewer ribs than women, and that this was passed down in the male line. There were a lot of superstitions, some of them religious and some of them mere superstition. And Vesalius was largely scornful of these popular beliefs. And one of the purposes of the Fabrica was to set aside these popular beliefs of midwives and other people. Scientific skepticism was one of the first components of modern science, which of course did not develop in the 16th century, but much more in the 17th. So skepticism is embedded in a phrase of Horace that Vesalius had picked up at some point, which in English is given to swear by the words of no man. And that later became the motto of the Royal Society in London. And so Vesalius, although he didn't create the phrase, he certainly refers to it again and again. It is a recurrent paraphrase in the Fabrica and other writings of Vesalius. He believed in the importance of direct observation, and I think that's a very important thing to remember about Vesalius' contribution to the scientific revolution. Did Vesalius ever, by accident or indirection, dissect a living person? A person in a deep coma who had not actually died? This lies in the realm of hearsay and speculation. There's no good evidence that this accident actually happened with Vesalius and a living subject. The Fabrica had a great deal of impact in later generations. In fact, over time, it had greater influence because the proofs that Vesalius offered that the classical sources of anatomy were based on non-human sources became more widely accepted. So it was not only his illustrations that were widely copied and plagiarized, but there was a gradual waning of Galenism and an acceptance of Vesalius' insistence upon direct observation and on the difference between human and animal anatomy.